did it in a way that not only benefited people like her who were in relationships at that time, but helped to pave the way for everything that has come since. I think you have to put Edie into the line of people who made the changes that led to marriage and still fighting about, but which she was never doubtful were going to happen.
And she was an engineer. So we get to claim that. And we actually have her wife here, Judith, over here today too. So we love you, Judith. You've said that you love making lists. We do too. We're big. We're into lists. So we just want to know what's on your list today. Obviously, now that you've come here, you can cross off lesbians you tacked on your bucket list. But outside of that, what's on your to-do list?
You know, winning the midterm elections and making sure that everybody votes. I mean, I shouldn't have to say this to this crowd because you guys are on the front lines of change. I mean, really making the future. But we have got to win both, at least one, preferably both houses of Congress. And we can't do that if people don't show up and vote. And it's been great that we've had so many people involved. So this new organization I started called Onward Together, we've been supporting candidates and we've been supporting groups that recruit candidates and train candidates and campaign for candidates. So I'm doing other things, a paperback of my book. I was just telling Kara Swisher, who's here, and that, you know, that was not flannel, that was cashmere that she did. Just so you know. But I looked at the label just because I've never seen anything quite like it. I told her, you know, some of you might remember that she interviewed me 2 years ago, the spring of 2017, and it was a great interview. It was tough, as she always is, but during it, I said things like, you know, the Russians were more involved and all of that, and people were like, oh, she's awesome, crazy. So my paperback comes out Tuesday with, you know, some more information and an afterward. So my goal is to do everything I personally can do and to inspire you to do to elect Democrats and then to make sure it's not stolen and undermined, because we have a tremendous group of candidates, really terrific people. I've been doing fundraisers, especially for young women running for Congress, but it won't matter if we don't vote. So when you ask me, there's only one thing on my bucket list right now: do everything I can do to help us save our country.
Dear Madam President, an open letter to women who run the world, written by one of your former staffers, Jennifer Palmieri. She said, Donald Trump in the 2016 election is the disruption that came to politics to prove to us it is entirely broken. Do you think that's true?
Look, I think Jen, who has a wealth of experience in politics, wrote an amazing book, the Dear Madam President book. And in it, it's very personal about her experience in my campaign, but also how surprising it was that someone who was as not only disruptive, that's not fair, because disruption is sometimes really positive, and I don't think that he was or is. But someone who came to a presidential election and engaged in behavior that we had never seen before, and has given unfortunate support to people who are now feeling much freer to be biased in all kinds of ways, whether it's racist or misogynistic or homophobic or Islamophobic or xenophobic, whatever it might be. So disruptive maybe, but it was more, to my mind, just unleashing a lot of the worst impulses, feelings, attitudes, biases that have never gone away, but which we have tried to contain, and he just, you know, pulled the top off of the Pandora's box. So yeah, it's been disruptive, but more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you wrote a book called What Happened, and I'm just curious how you picked the title. and more specifically, how you chose not to have any punctuation. There's no period, there's no question mark, it's just what happened.
Yeah. Well, that was, look, that's good, I like that. When I was trying to make sense of the election, which was very hard to do, I kept thinking, I have all these questions, I don't know what happened. So I needed to try to figure that out, and my publisher said, write another book. And I said, look, the only book I want to write right now is try to figure out what happened in the election. And I think everybody was a little dubious, because how are you going to find out? How do you do it without sounding sour grapes and all of that? But I was just obsessed with it because I couldn't figure it out. And so then I dove into it, and the information that was becoming more available, some of it was around during the election, but not given any particular attention or importance. So once I got into it and I finished a first draft in a kind of red hot frenzy, and they read it and they said, oh my gosh, that could actually be published. So as I was getting toward the end, because I wrote it in like 6 months, I said, what am I going to call it? And we had a lot of conversations about it, and everybody kept saying to me, well, you're really writing about what happened. And I said, yeah, and I think I know what happened. So yeah, no punctuation, no question mark particularly.
I don't think you need it. I don't think you need it. Well, I just want to say, I listened to the interview with Karen. I did not think you were crazy, and about the Russia part of the election. And for me, after the election, I was really frustrated that it didn't get more attention. And then I realized that on October 7th, which is one of the most insane days we've probably ever had in our political history, it actually did get mentioned. Obama had a press conference that day, October 7th, stating that they had information that they were interfering with the election. It was the same day that Access Hollywood came out. There was a hurricane. It was the same day that the Dusty emails. And I'm just so curious, how was that day for you?
Just as you would probably imagine. You're right. I mean, the Obama administration that morning came out with the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of the CIA, who basically said the Russians are interfering in the election. They couldn't, they couldn't reveal
because they don't have interpretation.
It was highly classified and all that, but they did lay it out there. But literally, I don't think it was in the news cycle for an hour before the Hollywood Access tapes came out. And everybody thought, oh my gosh, that's the end, that's the end. And then the Russians, through their cutout of WikiLeaks, which, as I've said before, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Russian intelligence now. Unfortunately, it didn't start out that way, but that's where it is today. They dumped all these emails, and not only dumped them, but weaponized them. They had a series of stories that they were making up using the emails in order to discredit me and obviously sow confusion. So all of that happened within 8 hours, and it just made your head spin, because one thing would be enough. But what I learned this time in this election was how hard it was when you flood the zone to cover it. I've talked to so many reporters since who had a hard time making sense of the election, and then initially had a hard time making sense of the administration, and they just are drinking from fire hoses all the time. And when you add what the so-called mainstream media is trying to cover with everything that is online, much of it's still being promoted by the Russians, it's really difficult for people to sort it out. So that day was just a headbanger. You just couldn't believe what was happening, and that you couldn't get through to have one story like the Russians are invading our electoral system. Stick with that for at least 48, 72 hours. But it was really hard.
Do you regret not focusing on it more now?
Yeah, I regret that we couldn't figure out how to break through either. We started in the summer of 2016, and particularly around our convention, talking to anybody that we could talk to, my staff did, to point out the connection between, you know, the Russians stealing the DNC emails and then weaponizing those and dropping those and everything that we knew up until then. And in the late summer, it was clear more was going on. I wasn't privy to it, but I could tell because there were public statements by certain Democratic members of Congress that basically alluded to a lot more happening than we were even aware of. But you couldn't pin it down. And so our efforts to try to persuade the press to dive in were not successful. And we weren't able either to do a good job in discrediting the flood of emails that came in October. I mean, they were absurd on their face, like, you know, we're running a child pedophile ring in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington. I mean, who makes that stuff up? But it was very, very much in the news, and it was pushed. And you know, you say, well, look, the pizzeria doesn't even have a basement. I mean, there's no.
There's a lot of fake news happening.
There are no facts here. But what the Russians understood and what Trump's campaign and the Republicans understood is, if they targeted those stories to certain people, they had a good chance of a percentage, and they didn't need much, as we know, a percentage believing stories like that. And so it was a hard couple of weeks.
So we're 53 days away from the midterms. How do we make sure, I mean, A, do you think this is happening now, and B, how do we stop it from happening if it is in the future?
Well, what we know is even the intelligence officials working in the Trump administration went to the White House briefing room about a month ago and said it is happening still. The Russians are now clearly in our electoral systems, but we don't have a good strategy to combat them. In some states that are controlled by the other party, I think they believe that it's to their benefit, so they're not going to really go into a deep investigation. The Democrats, actually it was bipartisan, an effort to try to do more to protect these upcoming elections, which voted down. So every possible approach to try to protect us from whatever it is they're doing, and there are many different ideas about that, are being stymied. So the best way to deal with it is to just overwhelm with numbers so that they can't shade them on the margins, they can't suppress their way to a victory by preventing people, young people, minorities, older people from voting. So I think that we've got to do everything we can, but we still don't know what exactly the Russians and their allies are planning this time.
Do we have more women, people of color, LGBTQ people running for office? Obviously, after the election, people were angry, and there's been this catalyzation of movement towards change. Obviously, you were a huge part of that, starting that beginning, really, I think, of the resistance that we're in today. How does that feel to know that what happened in the election resulted in this type of movement, and how are we going to sustain that energy?
It feels great. I mean, really, to see this outpouring of predominantly young people and overwhelmingly women, LGBTQ, people who are just not going to sit back and take it. They are out on the front lines. They're in the arena. It feels so right. It feels so good to see this kind of positive response, that people aren't lapsing into cynicism. They're not being so discouraged and depressed, although certainly a lot of us were for a while after the election, but now they are being fueled. Yes, they're being fueled to try to get their voices heard. And I've been doing some events for some of these young, exciting candidates, mostly young women, and I think we have so much energy on our side. And what we've got to do is sustain that through the election. But then we have to build it into the political system. I mean, one of our problems is that the other side has been building infrastructure, a whole ecosystem really, of organizations that fund people, that are organized to send judges to be confirmed. They've been, working on that for decades, who are on the forefront of changing laws at the state level. They have been building their infrastructure for 30, 40 years, and we have not been as focused. We go from campaign to campaign, and there's that old saying about campaigns and candidates that, Democrats like to fall in love and Republicans just fall in line. And there's a lot of truth.
We need to do both.
We need to do both.
We need to.
But we also need to understand that politics is not just about candidates and elections. You need to have a system in place that no matter who runs, no matter what year it is, you can support those people. And I really want to do a big shout out to the tech community, because a lot of people after the election in 2016, looked up and they said, we can do better. We can do better polling. We can do better, voter protection, campaign protection. So I've been working with and supporting some of those groups as well, because we were being, frankly, outmanned, outwomaned on the other side, because they had a system that they basically imposed. I'll give you one last thing, because I'm pretty, concerned about this. So Republican candidates are told to spend 40% of their advertising